I was asked today by several people, some of them sincerely and some of them insincerely, to discuss the definition of communism. On this channel in the past, I've discussed the definition of socialism, which is in many ways more interesting to me. I think a more nuanced and challenging area of discussion, especially in how it applies to politics today. I've also discussed the meaning of being left-wing, being right-wing, left and right as broad cultural categories, as political concepts that seem so malleable and have different meanings in different cultures and different periods of history. But today we're talking about communism. And I'm going to approach this in the way I would approach it if I were a university professor putting together a course, putting together a set of readings for the students to do. Many people would presume to begin a discussion of communism at the end by talking about dictatorships that killed tens of millions of people, dictatorships like Joseph Stalin in Russia and Mao Zedong in China, by discussing the great disasters that have come to define the significance of communism in the public imagination. I think it's actually really important to begin a discussion of the meaning of communism, the definition, and how it changed over time by looking at the period before Karl Marx. I would assign as the first reading in a course of this type Thomas More's Utopia. Utopia by Thomas More. It's impossible to exaggerate how influential this book was historically, and yet on the other hand, it's impossible to exaggerate how unknown and forgotten it is now. Today, when people read this book, it's very difficult for them to even apprehend what it was that was so inspiring or so important about it. And that is, in some ways, a reflection of just how influential it's been. It's become so influential that its influence has become pervasive to the point of being invisible. It's also very strange because Thomas More's Utopia is ultimately a somewhat silly book. It's written with a very strange, uniquely British sense of humor, or I should say distinctively British sense of humor. Does anyone really think that Thomas More is seriously proposing that in the future mankind should have a utopia where people make toilets out of solid gold, where their chamber pots are gold, so that they come to regard gold as something worthless? No, probably not literally. This is, again, a sort of strange, dry sense of humor, but it is part of the process of him putting forward his point. Thomas More can be very directly contrasted to Bernard Mandeville in The Fable of the Bees. Bernard Mandeville is definitely one of the most important thinkers and philosophers in the history of political economy, the development of economics as a science, and even, in a sense, the ethics of capitalism. If Bernard Mandeville is the first bold step off in one direction with his thesis that public virtues are private vices, then Thomas More's Utopia is a step in the opposite direction. Thomas More gave people the thrilling idea that what they ought to accomplish in future is a society with no money at all, with the abolition of money itself. And it's very significant to note that to some extent in the original text, Thomas More is joking. When the text was, for example, translated into Japanese and Chinese, any trace of that dry British sense of humor was gone. Now, what was Thomas More joking about? In a sense, he was joking about the way in which ancient Greek and Roman ideas were being imported to England, France, Germany, Western Europe in his time. There was being imported or exported across many centuries and also across geographical and cultural barriers. There's no doubt that a course dealing with communism in a thoroughgoing way could also look for components of the definition of communism in ancient Greek writing. If I had to pick just two sources, I would probably pick Aristotle and the comedian Aristophanes, just some short passages from Aristophanes. Aristophanes provides illustrations of the extent to which in ancient Athens, people were really interested in entertaining ideas about creating a whole new society out of radically different principles, radically restructuring the nature of the family, the nature of property. Of course, one of the simplest forms of radical redistributions of wealth was simply for the government to take away all the land from the rich people and give it to all the poor people. This happened again and again in ancient Greece. And note that I'm not saying Athens, but in the greater Greek area that's observed and commented on by people like Aristotle. The idea of the government taking away private property and redistributing it was a, shall we say, a commonplace feature of revolutions in ancient Greece, and continued to be discussed and reflected upon, at least, in ancient Rome. The role of the state, the notion of private property, the idea that the state had the role of master educator in forming and reforming human nature, these ideas are powerfully found in ancient Greek sources, and indeed they became very dangerous in 19th and 20th century communism. So we could look for some elements of that in Aristotle, some evidence in Aristophanes, and then I think ultimately you'd have to deal with some of the historical and pseudo-historical sources on Sparta. In early communism, it's actually remarkable how often people observing what was going on, for example, in the Soviet Union in the 1920s, referred to it as the new Sparta and made both joking and serious comparisons to Sparta. The extent to which Sparta and lies told about Sparta, because it's normally not the real historical facts about Sparta, but the mythology surrounding Sparta inspired communists and fascists alike, all kinds of radical and extreme political movements in the history of Europe, is unbelievable. But one of the legends about Sparta, and this is really drawing the line from Thomas More to communism in a powerful way, one of the most important legends about Sparta was the idea that people there had no money, that they had no gold, that it was shameful for them to buy and sell land or property of any kind, that it was a culture utterly set against commerce and instead fixated on a very different notion of true virtue. And in some ways, of course, the philosophy of Plato is a response to that and a commentary on that. Now, anyone who gives careful and balanced consideration will realize that this has about as much relation to real life as Sesame Street resembles an actual street in a real city. But in any case, the historically real Sparta inspired these legends, and these legends in their turn inspired a range of utopian thinkers. To some extent, Thomas More, but much more those who came in the centuries that followed after Thomas More's Utopia. Now, I'm not going to say a lot further here about communists before Karl Marx. It's important to note, though, that Karl Marx himself, who was, put it this way, he was more famous and influential after he died than when he was alive. Karl Marx himself referred to other people as communists. There's a very telling quotation in which Karl Marx refers to Louis-Auguste Blanqui and the Blanquists as the real communists. In many ways, the life of Karl Marx is when communism ceases to have anything meaningful to do with communes, which, again, this could be a whole separate long lecture about that. Many people ask me, I can remember some of my ex-girlfriends saying, why is it that communists are so little interested in communes? The use of the term communist and communard, and the use of these terms in various French revolutions, plural. You have to remember, in French, the word commune doesn't really have the same meaning as it has in English, and France is really another big forgotten source of inspiration for the history of communism. People today, of course, think of Russia, China, even places like Cuba. But France was much, much more important in the past than people now think it was for how communism as an ideology and political movement developed, and for how Karl Marx's own thought developed. Karl Marx and Engels were basically obsessed with the details of the French Revolution, and indeed a sense of just how committed they were to violence was that they examined that history, and their conclusion was not that the future of their hypothetical political movement, the political movement they were writing down on paper but not actually leading, they committed their movement to being much more violent than the disasters of the French Revolution, or French Revolutions plural. They rejected a ameliorative and conciliatory approach to political progress and change. They looked at the violence and class warfare of the French Revolution, and they looked at the ideas about class struggle that they found in Aristotle. It really is Aristotle that's the single most important inspiration for Karl Marx, and is looking at the structure of class interest shaping society. They looked at all that legacy of violence. They looked at those examples, and they said, no, in the future, things ought to be more violent still. So, talking about then the Marxist period of communism. As we said, there's the pre-Marxist period and there's the Marxist period. We have the emergence here of several distinctive elements of communism that would continue up to this day. From the first period, from Thomas More's Utopia forward, we had the idea of abolishing money. that this ideal, which is again found in ancient Sparta, at least mythologically, found in Thomas More's Utopia, that would continue through to the present day. It's not Karl Marx's special fascination, but it does indeed continue through Karl Marx. The idea of abolishing currency itself, I would say, it doesn't have the same emphasis in Karl Marx as other elements of communism. But in Marx, one of the distinctive elements of his approach that sets him apart from other communists, communards, revolutionary utopian thinkers, is the emphasis on class struggle, class warfare, materialist dialectics. The idea that his interpretation of history was a prediction of the future that was ineluctable and inevitable because of his analysis of, quote-unquote, the material conditions of class struggle, so on and so forth. With Marx, we have set in stone, so to speak, a formula for violence, and the idea that social progress can only come about through struggle, through class war, that it's only exclusively when the working class rises up and takes away the means of production from the more elite classes, the bourgeois class, the aristocrats, and so on, that is absolutely the only way forward in history, and there's no value whatsoever, for example, in the aristocrats becoming more kindly disposed towards the people, or the bourgeoisie becoming, better at caring for the welfare of factory workers, or law and regulations improving the conditions of factory workers. No. That, in Marx's view, is false consciousness. False consciousness is false in contrast to what was fundamentally the view of class self-interest set down by Aristotle. So in many ways, Karl Marx took Aristotle's philosophy of how society works and turned it on its head, turned it upside down. Now, those of you who are familiar with kind of mainstream Marxist dogmatism will know that the standard phrase said about the origin of Karl Marx's philosophy was that he took the philosophy of Hegel and turned it on its head. I think there's very little truth and very little utility to that, and I'm in a position to say, because I've actually read the philosophy of Hegel, very few people have. It's incredibly boring, and it has very, very little relation to, in a meaningful sense, the discussion we're having today, the meaning of Marxism. So in moving forward from the pre-Marxist period to the Marxist period, quite a few distinctive features of communism are added to the list in Marxist period. If you're doing a full course, you could really make a checklist and work through them. And it's worth noting, to some extent, Marx commits to any one of these, but only to a limited extent. So, to give an example, if you move all the way forward to Mao Zedong in China in the 1960s, by that period of time, it was obvious to everyone who was a communist that what communism necessarily entailed was the destruction of religion in the most literal sense, persecuting Buddhist monks, burning down Buddhist monasteries, so on and so forth. Now, if you go back and look at Karl Marx's own writing, what he says about religion, Karl Marx does say that religion is the opiate of the masses, but if you read that in context, the opiate of the masses, the soul for a soulless world, it's not clear at all. I mean, it's not clear at all that what Karl Marx had in mind was what seemed so obvious to everyone, being the meaning of communism by the time Mao Zedong is in power. So in that same way, you can look at assumptions about, for example, what does it mean to abolish the free market? You have free market systems and you have anti-free market systems. It's very clear that from Karl Marx's period forward, communism is identified with being anti-free market. But what does that really entail? Does it mean that they want a command economy or not? Now, I think you can go through Marx's own work and you can compare what he says in different contexts. Most of what he has to say is negative. I mean, a very large part of what he has to say in Das Kapital is just lamenting how, from his perspective, capitalism is awful and doomed. There are many, many, many passages of Marx in which he seems to be saying that feudalism was better than capitalism. Even many passages where he's talking about the advantages of slavery, where he seems to think slavery is better than capitalism. So he kind of is using any contrast or argument possible to make it seem as if capitalism is so terrible. Even, by the way, in his brief discussions of slavery in the United States of America, or slavery of black African people in the United States, those are really, really weird. But anyway, Karl Marx didn't know much about most of the stuff he passed judgment on. He didn't know much about the history of the United States of America, nor India, nor China. He wrote on all these topics liberally. In any case, you can move forward looking at this as being like a Velcro ball that's rolling across a carpet, picking up more and more lint as it goes. You already have a kernel of the idea starting in ancient Sparta, and to some extent ancient Athens, coming through Thomas More's Utopia. Thomas More adds the crucial element of wanting to abolish money and blaming the existence of money itself. Karl Marx is then a new stage where we have the accumulation of several new distinctive features of communism, and that really separates communism at that point from the earlier, frankly, more idealistic, less violent period of various schools of communists and communards. Anyway, in a more open-minded period when someone like Karl Marx himself could look at a totally different philosophy like Louis-Auguste Blanqui and say, oh, they're legitimate communists, they're the real communists. After Karl Marx, the definition of communism becomes narrow from the perspective of communists themselves, and they become intensely interested in persecuting and murdering one another, internal violence within communism, so that only people who meet their precise definition of what communism is, frankly, are allowed to live. That's very similar to the history of many mainstream religions. Both Catholicism and Protestantism have a long history of that they have a definition, and anyone who doesn't measure up to it is much more of a threat to the coherence of that religion than outside and openly opposed forces. So, rolling along the carpet then, you get into a discussion of Lenin and how Marxist-Leninism is different from Marxism. Obviously, you'd have to deal with Stalinism. Obviously, you'd have to deal with Mao Zedong. But of course, there were smaller. Yugoslavia has its own whole history of communist philosophy and communism in practice, which can be very illuminating. You can look at, obviously, from my perspective, places like Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. These are also interesting mirrors to hold up to how these different ideologies developed as they went on. So, what is communism? How are you going to define it? Well, one of the crucial clarifications that I've had to make again and again is that communism promises that the workers will take over the means of production. But what it delivers in practice is that the state will take over the means of production. It promises that the farmers will take back the land from the landlords, that the poor will take back ownership of the land from the aristocrats. But what it delivers is that all land ownership is taken away and centralized by the state. Communism is indeed defined in historical reality by command economy and by centralization as opposed to decentralization to an astounding extent. It's defined in practice by totalitarianism, by the extension of government control over all else, basically a form of military dictatorship that to a greater and greater extent dictates every element of human life. And why is that? Well, it is probably because, as mentioned at a much earlier stage, it was very clear what Karl Marx was against, what he wanted to abolish. He wanted to abolish the free market. He wanted to abolish capital itself. He wanted to abolish banking. He wanted to abolish investments. He wanted to abolish these things. The word abolish is very easy to throw around. And then in practice, what are you really going to replace it with? One way or another, again and again, what we saw was simply the extension of the military over these things, or of command economy, state organs, offices, and bureaucracies that very fundamentally mimic military organization, and that also, like the military, ultimately rely on violence to force people to comply. There's a very good book called The New Class by Milovan Djilas. So Milovan Djilas, which is spelled D-J-I-L-A-S. Milovan Djilas lived through the formation of actually existing communism in Yugoslavia. And he points out, I think relatively concisely, it's a short book, that while the communists promised, a new type of freedom, what they actually delivered was a return to a type of feudalism. It created a new type of aristocracy. It was simply an aristocracy defined by your status within the Communist Party.